Plumes of smoke rise above Abidjan's skyline. French and UN helicopters have been attacking Laurent Gbagbo's forces and strongholds in the city, a major escalation of the international community's efforts to oust the entrenched leader. Gbagbo and his supporters are determined to hold on to power.
If there's a nation that never hesitates to shed African blood to safeguard its neo-colonial interests, it is France. From brutal military interventions to covert operations, France relentlessly clings to its former colonies, exploiting Africa's resources while masquerading its imperial ambitions as benevolent guardianship. Africa's freedom remains shackled. The game of shedding African blood in the name of colonial power interests must end. In October 2000, President Laurent Gbagbo won a decisive election in Ivory Coast. Gbagbo has yearned to break free from the tight French stranglehold on the country. If France were to loosen its hold on Ivory Coast, the other 13 CFA member countries might follow suit, leaving France as a king without clothes. This would not only damage France's international prestige, but also its economy. Without Francophone Africa, France is nothing. In the past, any Francophone African president who even hinted at breaking away from French influence or suggested changes to the CFA arrangements was swiftly removed through a coup d'etat. This instilled a deep fear among Francophone leaders, paralyzing them and preventing any action against the colonial pact. In 2002, while President Gbagbo was on a visit to Italy, France instigated a coup d'etat to overthrow him. President Jacques Chirac offered Gbagbo political asylum in France, but he refused and hurried back to Ivory Coast amid a counter-assault by his loyalist forces to reclaim the capital, Abidjan. Unfortunately, the conflict escalated into a rebellion, leading to a civil war that divided the country in two, with the government controlling the south and rebels backed by the French controlling the north. It's important to note that the northern part of Ivory Coast has a majority Muslim population. Despite the divisions and the rapid deterioration of the country, the French, however, lived a lavish lifestyle since the reign of the previous Ivorian president, Félix Houphouët-Boigny, the man who signed the colonial pact and sold Ivory Coast's sovereignty to France after its independence. Ivory Coast was nicknamed the Miracle, not because of its vast natural resources, but because after gaining independence, Europeans flocked to the country after being kicked out from most of the neighboring countries. In fact, the term Françafrique was coined by Boigny. Boigny's infrastructure development projects were carried out by the French to improve the lives of Europeans in Africa. His main achievement was building the largest church in the world in Africa to impress Europeans. The Basilica of Our Lady of Peace in Yamoussoukro is larger than St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican City. It holds the Guinness World Record for the largest church in the world. It covers an area of 30,000 square meters and has the capacity to accommodate 18,000 worshippers. The French even had Boigny construct a hidden underground tunnel linking the African presidential palace to the French embassy, a clandestine passage of control and surveillance. This is not just an act of arrogance, it is a deep and unforgivable insult to African pride and dignity. He held on to power until his death in 1993. Boigny was buried in the same church he built. What followed was a series of treacheries and French-backed coups that deeply divided the African country. The newly elected President Laurent Gbagbo failed to unite the country because the French armed the northern part to keep the nation divided. The president, in retaliation, exposed to the world the secret tunnel that linked the presidential palace to the French embassy. The tunnel was then sealed to keep the French Secret Service out of the presidential affairs. Gbagbo also exposed for the first time to the African public the secretive European colonial pact. In simple words, the colonial pact requires that France reserves the first right to purchase or reject any natural resources discovered in Francophone countries. This means that even if African countries could secure better prices elsewhere, they are not allowed to sell these resources to other buyers until France declines to purchase them. Furthermore, the Colonial Pact stipulates that when awarding government contracts in African countries, French companies must be given priority consideration. Only if these companies are not selected can African countries seek other options. This is true even if better value for money could be found elsewhere. French companies are given priority and must secure the contract. In Abidjan, the capital of Ivory Coast, Gbagbo's government planned to construct a third major bridge to connect the central business district with the rest of the city, separated by a lagoon. According to colonial pact tradition, the contract had to go to a French company, which quoted a ridiculous price to be paid in euros or US dollars. Angered, Gbagbo once again exposed to the world how France impoverishes the African continent. He turned to the CPC in China to obtain a second quote from a Chinese company, which offered to build the bridge at half the price quoted by the French. The Chinese, on the other hand, did not demand payment in the form of currency because they were aware of the European CFA's diabolical schemes that were designed to impoverish Africans. Instead, the Chinese agreed to be paid in cocoa beans, a resource of which Ivory Coast is the world's largest producer. Yes, you heard that right, payment in cocoa beans. As expected, the French refused and threatened to invade the country. Nearly all major utilities in Ivory Coast, such as water, electricity, telecommunications, transport, ports, and major banks, are controlled by France. This control extends to commerce, construction, and agriculture, particularly in cocoa plantations. The Colonial Pact established a legal framework that grants France a privileged position in the political and economic affairs of its former colonies. Through the defense agreements linked to the Colonial Pact, Paris is legally entitled to intervene militarily in African countries and also maintain permanent military bases. President Gbagbo tried to negotiate with the French government for cooperation based on respect for African sovereignty, but his request was rejected. The president decided to confront the rebels without foreign interference. During the military operation, France accused Gbagbo of bombing the French army stationed in a high school in northern Ivory Coast. France supported the rebels and then accused the African president of killing 9 European soldiers with the help of Belarusian mercenaries. France deployed its fighter jets and completely annihilated the Ivorian Air Force. Africa was outraged because France, after independence, still have the power to send its army to attack an African country. President Gbagbo called on young Ivorians to rebel against the colonial master. Africans all over West Africa crossed the Ivorian border in a show of solidarity with the brave Laurent Gbagbo. Large crowds gathered in front of the Hôtel Ivoire, where most Europeans were staying. The following day, on November 9, 2004, the French army opened fire on civilians, killing hundreds of Africans. It is clear that France is determined and hell-bent on keeping Africans in slavery. The young Africans did not give up. They marched fearlessly to surrender the airport and the French military bases in the capital city. French helicopters opened fire on the unarmed young protesters crossing the bridge that linked the city center to the airport. Despite the bombings and the deluge of live ammunitions, the young Ivorians defied the colonial master, chanting, "Down with France and long live the independent Ivory Coast."
Nous allons pousser pour qu'il nous rende notre dignité. Nous allons pousser pour qu'il nous rende notre indépendance. Nous allons pousser pour que la libération de l'Afrique tout entière parte de la Côte d'Ivoire. C'est ça qui est la vérité.
The young African protesters' faith in their president kept him in power despite French aggression and attempted coup d'etat. The president became a symbol of hope for the African liberation movement in West Africa because he openly defied the colonial masters and remained unseated. Gbagbo's overly confident president proposed new investment opportunities to French businesses based on mutual benefits rather than the old master-slave neo-colonial relationship. He underestimated the Europeans. Vincent Bolloré, the most influential European billionaire in Africa, accepted his proposals.
Bien sûr, vous êtes des hommes d'affaires. On fait du gagnant-gagnant. Win-win. Quand vous investissez, c'est parce que vous gagnez. Mais moi, je suis content parce que je gagne aussi. Parce que la Côte d'Ivoire, je gagne aussi.
But there was one condition. Gbagbo would have to accept Alassane Ouattara, a man chosen by France, to participate in the next election as opposition. In May 2005, Alassane Ouattara was officially allowed to run in the Ivorian presidential elections by a ruling of the Ivorian Supreme Court. This decision came after a prolonged period of political disputes and negotiations, during which Ouattara's eligibility had been a contentious issue, mainly due to questions surrounding his nationality. The French-chosen puppet had Burkinabe heritage and had once held Burkinabe nationality. The court's ruling allowed him to participate in the elections, which were initially scheduled for 2005, but eventually took place in 2010. The president accepted the decision as part of the peace process following the Ivorian Civil War, which the French had created to destabilize Gbagbo presidency. In December 2010, the Independent Electoral Commission funded by France, the European Union and the UN announced that Alassane Ouattara had won the election with 54% of the vote. However, the president of the Constitutional Council declared the results invalid. The next day, the Constitutional Council declared Gbagbo the winner.
Fakesa Dugu, Katiola Bundiali, Dabakala Seguela are cancelled. Article 3. Mr. Laurent Gbagbo is declared President of the Republic of Ivory Coast.
Both Gbagbo and Ouattara claimed victory and took the presidential oath. Ouattara sent his own ambassador to New York to pledge allegiance to the United States and France, who had chosen him. The presidents of Benin, Nigeria, Sierra Leone and Cape Verde hastily suspended Ivory Coast from ECOWAS membership and threatened to use military force to remove President Laurent Gbagbo from power. This is the same ECOWAS that recently imposed sanctions on Niger, Mali and Burkina Faso following a series of successful military coups aimed at breaking free from European economic and military subjugation, an African intergovernmental organization that seems to work against its own people to safeguard European interests. After months of failed negotiations and sporadic violence, the crisis reached a critical point when France-backed forces loyal to Ouattara launched a military offensive, rapidly gaining control of most of the country and targeting key locations in Abidjan, the largest city. France and the US reported numerous human rights violations and backed the UN in undertaking military action with the stated goal of protecting European citizens and civilians. Ouattara's forces massacred civilians and blamed it on government forces to provide the perfect alibi for a French military invasion. Russia expressed concern that by declaring Ouattara the winner of the disputed election, the UN was exceeding its mandate, but the US supported France in its illegal schemes. In response, Russia blocked the Security Council statement endorsing Ivorian opposition candidate Alassane Ouattara as president. Following Russia's veto, Gbagbo remained defiant in the face of international sanctions and efforts by the World Bank and the West African Central Bank to block his access to funds. The military, the police and the people were all solidly behind the president, determined to resist France and any foreign intervention to the last drop of their blood and until the last man falls. What followed next was another example of Western violation of African sovereignty, aimed at terrorizing and discouraging any future rebellion against Western imperialism on the continent. French President Nicolas Sarkozy previously made a false claim that France would no longer interfere in the internal affairs of its former colonies.
La puissance coloniale,
a colonial power,
fut-elle quelques décennies en arrière,
even several decades afterwards,
toujours illégitime à prononcer
is always unjustified in pronouncing a judgment on the internal affairs of its former colony, and you know it,
et tout le monde le sait.
And everybody knows it.
In March 2011, France-backed Northern Ouattara's rebels, renamed the Republican Forces of Côte d'Ivoire, launched a full-scale offensive across the country. Ivory Coast's political capital, Yamoussoukro, and the western towns were taken without resistance. The rebels made sure to avoid fighting near any French businesses and European residencies. Large numbers of people were found dead after Ouattara's forces took control of the central Ivorian towns. Here is the crazy part. The United Nations blamed the RFCI for the slaughter of many innocent civilians, yet went ahead of the French operation to remove the President Laurent Gbagbo from power. When the rebel reached the capital city Abidjan, Ouattara declared a 3-day curfew to allow the French army and the United Nations peacekeepers to take control of the international airport. Helicopters belonging to the United Nations were operated by crews from the Ukrainian army. These Ukrainian military personnel were assigned to help carry out the French military operation named Operation Licorne.
Победы! Ура!
Talk about karma if you understand what I am referring to here. On April 4th, additional French troops landed at Abidjan airport. French helicopters began firing on pro-Gbagbo military installations. French forces also blew up the wall, blocking the secret getaway tunnel connecting the Ivory Coast's presidential palace to the French embassy. Ouattara's forces then stormed the residence and seized the president. The rebels announced that they had captured the President Gbagbo and handed him over to French forces, who allegedly turned him over to the United Nations peacekeepers. The African president was kidnapped and humiliated by France. Gbagbo was subsequently transferred to the International Criminal Court, ICC, a court that has been criticized for disproportionately targeting African leaders. The president faced charges of crimes against humanity, including murder, rape, and persecution. However, in January 2019, after 7 years in detention, the ICC judges acquitted him, ruling that the prosecution had failed to provide sufficient evidence of his responsibility for the alleged crimes.
The Chamber, by majority, hereby decides that the prosecutor has failed to satisfy the burden of proof to the requisite standard as foreseen in Article 66 of the Rome Statute. Grants the defense motions for acquittal from all charges against Mr. Laurent Gbagbo and Mr. Charles Blé Goudé. Ordered the immediate release of both accused pursuant to Article 81(3)(c) of the statute.
France humiliated an African president, caused mass murder and war in Africa, only for the ICC to later admit that Gbagbo was innocent. France achieved its goal by subjugating Ivory Coast after overthrowing President Laurent Gbagbo. Today, the nation is burdened by debt to French companies and trapped by the IMF, its sovereignty eroded. But the spirit of Africa is unbreakable. Do you believe that Africa will eventually break free from France and its Western imperial allies? Let us know in the comments.